Imagine a pope who is not afraid of challenging centuries of tradition. A leader who, instead of surrounding herself with luxury and formality, decides to sacrifice everything for the greater purpose of the Church. Leo XIV arrived to break the currents of the past and take the Vatican by an unknown but essential path. In a bold gesture, he declared war against opulence, the financial power, and especially against the spiritual self, indulgence that has taken over a church that forgot its true purpose, to serve. The Pope's voice cut the silence of the Clementine room like a sword, announcing that the Vatican would no longer be a museum of traditions, but an action church of transformation. What comes next will change everything, and you're about to witness not only the reforms of a man, but of a spiritual revolution, a revolution that can scare, but that deep down is exactly what the Church of Christ needs to return to its essence. This is the story of how Leo XIV dared to challenge centuries of history to restore the heart of the Church. Continue with us and find out how he dismantled ancient traditions, challenged the hierarchy, and reintegrated the values of the gospel in a church that urgently needed to renew herself. Prepare yourself, because the impact of these changes will be felt for generations. If you got here, know that it was no coincidence. The Spirit brought us to this moment to reflect on the true direction of our faith, seeking no longer to follow the ways of the world, but the eternal truths that guide us. Share in the comments from where you are watching this video. It's not just a comment, but a way to show that even separated by continents, we are united by the same faith. Before following with content, subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge, illuminate, and connect us. Together, let's explore transformations that call us to reflect and act. Now let me take you back to the moment you have changed. Pope Leo XIV's entrance into the Clementina room marked the beginning of a silent but relentless revolution within the Catholic Church. Unlike previous popes that respected millennial traditions and maintained an image of authority based on formalities, Leo made a radical announcement that shook the Vatican's foundations. He declared, directly and bluntly, that the Church would no longer be a museum of dead traditions. This statement echoed on the Vatican walls and had a great impact among the cardinals present. The Pope knew that his role was more than just being a guardian of traditions. He had been chosen to lead a substantial change that aimed to modernize the Church and reorient it to the essential values of Christianity. For Leo, the true mission of the Church was to serve humanity, especially to the most needy, and not to preserve the status quo of practices that, in his view, no longer served the purposes of Christ. The Cardinal Predosta transition to Pope Leo XIV was not just a change of leadership, but a historic turn to the Catholic Church. Leo knew he had been chosen for something larger than his predecessor. Pope Francis had already begun. Francis was admired for his reforms, but Leo felt that his mission demanded something even more radical, something that touched the deepest structures of the Church. In the early months of his papacy, Leo experienced the pressure of a centenary tradition that was not willing to give in. Although the Vatican was full of glorious stories of achievements and traditions, he was called to change the course of Church history. In reflecting on the weight of inheritance, Leo understood that he was not being called only to maintain traditions, but to restore the heart of the Church, his vocation to serve and help the needy. Leo XIV soon showed that he did not care about the traditional protocols of the papacy. In a rupture gesture with previous practices, he entered the Clementine room without the usual pomp and without the Swiss guards accompanying all the popes. His way of presenting himself was symbolic, simple, and without formalities. For Leo, the true authority did not come from grandiose ceremonies, but from personal testimony and authenticity. This contempt for the protocol also reflected his attitude toward the Church as an institution. He believed that the Church should not be a fortress of power and control, but a service community. His posture was an invitation for the cardinals to reflect on the true mission of the papacy. In his view, the Church should be a house of prayer and action, not an institution cast by appearances. One of Leo XIV's most amazing acts was the decision to dissolve pontifical marriage, a tradition that came from centuries and was seen as essential to maintain the dignity and power of the papacy. For the cardinals present, this seemed unthinkable. The pontifical marriage had been one of the pillars of papal administration, organizing ceremonies and hearings since the Middle Ages. However, Leo firmly argued that Christ never had court, ceremonial master, or a rigid structure of power. He believed that the Church should reflect Christ's acts and teachings more than the power structures created by tradition. The dissolution of pontifical marriage, in his view, would not only modernize the papacy, but would also relieve financial resources that could be used to help the needy. Leo was more focused on restoring the role of the church as a servant of the people, not preserving old ceremonies that, for him, no longer had the spiritual relevance they had once. In another radical decision, Leo XIV announced a deep reform in the Vatican Bank, directly challenging the way the church dealt with its wealth. Leo not only criticized the use of resources in areas such as fossil armaments and fuels, but also determined that any investment that violated human rights principles was abandoned. The measure was seen as an attack on the church's financial stability, especially since many of the church's charity and maintenance work depended on bank investments. Leo responded to these concerns with a firm speech. The church could not maintain its moral authority as it accumulated wealth in questionable way. He argued that Vatican's future investments should be aligned with the principles of Catholic social doctrine, focusing on more ethical actions, such as support for refugees and initiatives to combat poverty. Leo knew that his decision would bring great repercussions, but it was determined to restore the church's bond with the gospel values, far from the influence of financial power. In making decisions that challenged the established standards of the Vatican, Leo XIV not only broke ancient traditions, but also redefined the meaning of papal authority. Instead of surrounding himself with pompous rituals and ceremonies, he sought a more humble and direct approach, focusing on the spirituality and mission of the church, not his ostentation. In rejecting traditional protocols, Leo signaled that the church should be a place of genuine service, not an institution that prioritized prestige and power. For him, the true authority of the papacy came from the example of Christ, simple, accessible, and focused on the welfare of others. This radical change, by ignoring the formality of traditions, brought with it both the resistance of the most conservative and the support of those who believed that the church needed a deep renewal to remain relevant in the modern world. Leo XIV also introduced a revolutionary reform into the church's governance structure, creating a committee composed equally by men and women, with a focus on the global south. The idea of a more inclusive governance that took into account the realities of women and the most marginalized regions aimed to create a more representative and connected church with the diversity of the world. Leo's proposal was Clara, a church that was led by communities and not just by a small elite of cardinals and clerics from Europe and North America. Including women and leaders from different regions, he sought a governance structure that was more aligned with Christian values of equality, service, and compassion. This reform was not well received by all, with many European and traditional cardinals questioning change, but Leo's view was from a more united and democratic church, focused on serving God's people in all their forms. With the intention of changing the focus of the church from its riches and power to genuine service to the most needy, Leo XIV underlined the importance of a more marginal and marginalized church. He believed that Christ's true mission was never to preserve institutions or power, but to meet the needy, to offer mercy and justice. By implementing reforms that sought to redirect church resources to help the poor, refugees, and disasters victims, Leo demonstrated a radical view of Christianity, a church model that didn't fear losing power or wealth in favor of a real commitment to the gospel. He knew that this change would face resistance, but believed that the needs of the people, especially the poorest and vulnerable, should be the priority. This transformation in the focus of the church generated internal divisions but also brought a breath of hope to those who have always felt neglected by the hierarchy of the church. It was not long before Leo XIV reforms would generate significant resistance within the church. Many cardinals and traditional leaders saw their decisions as a threat to the stability and authority of the papacy and began to organize against change. The central argument of the opponents was that by dismantling centuries of tradition and protocol, Leo was weakening the authority of the church and endangering its influence on the world. Internal resistance was not limited to administrative and financial issues, but extended to the point of questioning the legitimacy of reforms, with some members of the Vatican until suggesting that Leo could be considered an antipope. However, Leo knew that these reactions were natural in the face of any major change. He was determined to move on, believing that the Holy Spirit had guided him to these reforms, and that resistance should not prevent him from fulfilling his mission from restoring the true essence of the Church, as an institution dedicated to service, not to the power or preservation of old traditions. The radicality of Leo XIV reforms was not limited to administrative and financial changes, but extended directly to the heart of the mission and identity of the Catholic Church. Leo was determined to make the church an institution closer to its founders, rather than an ecclesiastical monarchy far from the real needs of people. He opposed the idea that the church should be protected by unchanging traditions, and believed that many of the traditional practices had become obstacles to true Christian testimony. By breaking with old practices, such as excessive papal protocols and alliances with financial interests, Leo aimed to create a simpler, more accessible and more committed church to Christ's teachings. His view of reform was not only administrative, but theological and spiritual, proposing a church that became more deeply involved with the social and spiritual issues of his time. Leo knew that these reforms would be seen by many as a revolution, but he was determined to make the church go back to their roots. The meeting of Leo XIV with religious leaders was marked by an exchange of unusual and unprecedented ideas within the Catholic Church. Unlike the formal and protocol audiences that the cardinals were used to, Leo preferred a more democratic and inclusive circle where everyone could express themselves freely. He made it clear that the reforms could not be imposed from top to bottom, but should emerge from the needs of the communities of faith and people. The change he proposed was a profound transformation of the power structure within the church, and he knew it would require the support of all levels, especially those closest to the base. Listening to the religious leaders of various congregations, Leo reinforced the idea that the renewal of the church could not come from the papacy, but from a church that was inclusive, representative, and more committed to the realities of the present world. This meeting reinforced Leo's view that the church should be a servant community and not a closed hierarchy. Leo XIV's reforms generated a big buzz in the media, dividing public opinion on several fronts. While part of society and church members applauded changes as a return to the fundamental values of Christianity, others saw reforms as a challenge to the traditional authority of the church. Leo became a controversial figure. While some saw him as a brave and necessary reformer, others considered him dangerous and radical. The impact of Vatican and Catholic world reforms was broadcast live, with the divided social media between supporting or criticizing their decisions. Leo was not intimidated by criticism and continued his mission of transforming the church, always reiterating that his actions were based on the truth of the gospel and the service to the poor. The often polarized media reaction reflected the internal resistance and fear of change, but also served to highlight the relevance of their reforms and how much they were resonating with the public. Leo XIV firmly believed that the church should not be a place of power or status, but a true representation of Christ's service and humility. For him, the church was being diluted in formalities and traditions that over time they moved her away from her true mission, serving to the most needy and being a lighthouse of light and hope for the world. His view of reform went far beyond mere structural or financial change. He wanted to restore the essence of the church as an institution focused on service, not to prestige. He understood that by dismantling the traditions that kept the church away from the people, it was getting closer to the teachings of Christ, which never sought power or wealth, but sought to heal, help, and guide. This reform was not about destroying, but about restoring the authenticity of the church mission, reaffirming its commitment to truth and unconditional love. The way the media interpreted Leo XIV's reforms was a reflection of the division within the church itself and society in relation to change. Many communication vehicles praised their actions as necessary and progressive, a movement towards a church more connected with the social and spiritual issues of the modern world. However, a significant part of the media questioned the speed and radicality of reforms, fearing that they would endanger the stability of the church. The external and internal resistance to his leadership was amplified by media coverage, which divided public opinion between those who saw Leo as a hero of faith and those who believed that their actions were compromising the traditional authority of the church. However, Leo remained firm in his vision, believing that regardless of public opinion, he was fulfilling his mission to restore the church to the fundamental principles that Christ had taught. For him, the truth of the gospel would always overcome criticism and fears of those who opposed change. The final confrontation between Leo XIV and its opponents within the church was inevitable. Throughout his papacy, he faced a growing resistance of conservative cardinals and leaders who saw his reforms as a threat to the power and stability of the church. In a tense meeting, Leo was challenged for the possibility of being removed from office or even facing a schism within the church. However, Leo was not intimidated. Instead of moving away or retreating, he maintained his posture of dialogue and faith, His answer to this resistance was clear. He was not there to preserve comfort or tradition, but to fulfill the mission God had given him. Leo knew that the truth of the gospel was not popular, and that the challenges and difficulties were inevitable. However, he believed that the true church should not fear the internal storms, but move on with courage, true to the example of Christ. The resistance he found did not discourage him. On the contrary, she reinforced her determination to continue working for the true reform of the church. Now you have seen the beginning of a revolution, but the true change, the one that transforms hearts and renews destinations, only happens when you take action. The church, as Leo XIV has shown, can no longer just be a monument to tradition. She needs brave people willing to change, starting over and living the true mission of the gospel. So don't let this message stop you. Share this video with those who also need to understand the urgency of spiritual reform. Be a voice in the multitude that seeks transformation, which knows that the world will not change alone. Change begins with you, with the action of a single gesture of faith. Subscribe on the channel now, so we can continue together on this journey of revelation and renewal, because reform is not just about what happened in the Vatican, but about what you are willing to turn into your life, your community, and the world around you. And remember, as Leo XIV taught us, don't be afraid to question, to break with the past, and to rebuild the church in its true form. The power of true transformation is in your hands. The time to act is now.